Gentlemen, well, I'm going to start off. Andrew, let's start off with you. And tell me, let me ask you one simple question. When we get up in the morning and we ask ourselves that simple question every emergency management manager asks themselves, are we ready? Can anybody in this world say yes? I mean, is that allowed to say, yes, I'm ready, bring it on, we're going to have a go? How ready are we?
I think that question's an interesting question at a couple of levels. One is,
okay,
what do we
by
mean?
The way, I know Andrew. Well, Andrew's going to keep on. You're going to say that's a very interesting question, David, and then completely ignore it and talk about something else. I recognise this is what's coming, my friend Andrew. So that's fine. But I've got your number. Right, let's go for it.
I think when we ask the question, are we ready for what's coming? One of the fundamental questions there is, what do we mean by ready? And we've had this discussion before, David, where the tools we've used in the past may not be suitable for what we're doing today, or they're suitable for some aspects of what we're doing today. And I've made a little note here about based off your introduction. Increasingly, there's a skill there for our decision makers. It's no longer, it's this particular hazard, this is what we do to respond to it. It's increasingly, what is the problem that I need to resolve, and therefore what are the tools I need to access to be able to resolve that? So Australia had some pretty atrocious fires in 2019, 2020. 2022 is mainly flooding. This year we've had parts of the country dealing with floods while other parts are dealing with fires. We've had a situation in one area where it started with fires and then it rained and they've had floods putting the fires out. So increasingly the hazard that you're looking at is probably becoming less important, and the consequences that you need to manage are the key aspect. And we talk a lot about the all hazard approach, which should be hazard agnostic, but what we tend to see is a multi-hazard approach of these are the 5, 10, 15, pick whatever the relevant number is for the jurisdiction, hazards that we are used to managing. They are what we will focus on. So the reality is, in most parts of Australia, whilst fire is a devastating hazard, increasingly it's flood that's causing the damage. The insurers will tell you we lose more from flood than we do from fire. And we're starting to look at what does that mean long term for not necessarily the loss of life from the event, but the flow-on effects of that event. So I think one of the challenges for a lot of organisations and for a lot of countries is to say, well, we have a fire service. That fire service knows how to address a fire, but is it necessarily the best placed organisation to manage what comes after the fire? So the displacement, the loss of infrastructure, how do you manage those things? Certainly Australia's undergone some fairly significant reviews of its critical infrastructure and how reliant we are on those systems. And I think one of the things that COVID, I'm not sure it's taught us yet, because for me, when you've learnt the lesson, you've actually made a systemic change and you are now dealing with a different system. The way you're approaching things is fundamentally different. So one of the questions that I think people can legitimately ask is, were our decision makers ready for COVID? Are they ready for the next big event? And what does ready actually mean? So if those decision makers are being advised by the appropriate people that these are the risks and threats that we need to manage and these are the types of things we'll need to look for, if they're being advised of that and ignoring it, that's a very different problem to their specialist advisors aren't stepping forward in the first place and saying, yes, this is a traditional hazard with which we are very familiar and we have a variety of organisations that address it, as opposed to we don't really know what this threat means. And I think the politics, and I've seen this recently in a couple of fairly significant risk assessments, where the risk assessments have been altered to make sure that all parties have the ability to continue to debate their current level of funding, rather than coming back to where should that funding now go to. And I think the other issue in there when we're talking about readiness, are we ready for those traditional risks so we know in a country like Australia and most countries, there are house fires every year. We're not saying get rid of the fire service. It's a well-known risk. But are we ready for the next firestorm? Are we not ready for the next major storm that knocks out infrastructure and denies access to electricity and telecommunications for 1, 2, 3, 5 weeks? That's a different problem to be managed than we understand the threat or the hazard, and we're able to manage it. Increasingly, I think the question is around, can we manage the consequences? And I think consequence-based risk assessments and systemic risk assessments, you knew I'd get that in as well, are becoming increasingly important. We have to understand the systemic effects and the cascading impact of an event.
Cheers, Andrew. I mean, the thing about it is, and we've discussed this deeply over 3 years. It's, do we actually have the language to describe the crises, the potential crisis events we're facing, and what that means? Or are we the equivalent of using an analog metaphor to describe not even a digital but an AI world? And of course, you cannot do that. But it seems that one of the things that you're talking about, systemic risks, is we still see risk very basically being linear and time limited and recoverable. And, if we do the right thing, then it all goes away. Of course, the nature of the world now seems to be that is no longer the case. We can't control it. And as you said, there's a significant difference, which most people, including major governments, get wrong, between emergency response and crisis management. COVID was an emergency, wasn't a crisis. COVID was an emergency, which people knew how to deal with. The epidemiologists knew how to deal with that. The crisis was the global lockdown, and how do we look after our societies and how do we look after our people? And they failed miserably.